and or after Ms. Barry finished the presentation, each presentation. We also are providing captioning, so for those that need it and requested it. Ms. Aissatou, you are whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Ms. Casanova. So, hello everyone. My name is Aissatou Barry, and I, along with my colleague Amber Marshall, are doing a presentation today about rent arrears. If you have any questions, like Ms. Casanova said, please put them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them as we go along. Okay. So why are we here? So we're here to understand what circumstances would an application for a rent arrears grant be necessary, how to figure out if your client is eligible for a rent arrears grant, how does HRA categorize what arrears are, tips and tricks for preparing an application to make sure that your client gets a rent arrears grant approval, and other ways to get the arrears.
Okay, I'll start off. So what is a rent arrears grant? Frequently, people refer to it as a one-shot deal or, some sort of assistance or a loan from HRA. But what we want to make sure folks understand is that it could be a grant, which is money you don't have to pay back, a loan, which you do have to pay back, or a combination of the two to pay off rent arrears to avoid eviction in emergency situations. Um, HRA has a specific definition of an emergency, and it includes pending non-payment proceedings, pending holdover proceedings, and folks who are in a post-eviction scenario. So they are out of possession. Um, Sometimes we get asked, does the HRA ever pay if you're not in housing court yet? The answer is yes, but they do prefer that a tenant at least have a rent demand, so some sort of letter from the landlord, saying that they're going to bring the tenant to court if they don't pay. And they, generally in that circumstance, want to see some sort of sympathetic factors explained to them
I got
before
big
approving
cameras
the
over.
grant.
Yeah, you didn't want this no more, right? The shape.
We'll just ask everyone to make sure they're on mute so that we don't have any background noise.
So Pete, right?
Can you mute? Thank you.
So is your client eligible? To be eligible for a rent arrears grant, they must show future ability to pay the rent. They must show that their income, right, the same amount of net cash after they're paying the rent is like a household and recipient of cash assistance. So we'll have a chart later on in the slides, but for a household of one, that's 183, for two, 291, etc. So the clients must use all available resources to pay the arrears. So whether they're receiving unemployment, some type of social security benefit, and sometimes even child support could qualify as proof that they will be able to pay their rent in the future. And they should at least have the current month's rent. The arrears must be reasonable, right? So essentially what that means is that it's going to be much more difficult to get arrears for a case where a client has $20,000 that they owe versus arrears for a client that has maybe 10,000 or less. They need to explain how they fell behind on their rent. Clients go through a lot of legitimate situations, but sometimes it's difficult to have to share that personal information with HRA, but it is important for HRA to know that whatever caused them to fall behind on their rent was a specific circumstance, and it's reasonable to expect that they fell into that situation and it won't happen again. What is their plan for getting a zero balance? Let's say, for example, they do have extremely high arrears, like $20,000. If the client is able to save some money, or if the client is able to get some money from another organization, they can lower their arrears, and that would help them easily get the rent arrears grant from HRA. Sympathetic facts. We understand that a lot of tenants right now have lost their income due to repercussions of being in the COVID-19 quarantine. And so, explaining what those factors are, explaining how they specifically impact the household or the family or other families that the tenant might be responsible for taking care of now. Any sympathetic factors related to health, employment, household circumstances, it's relevant to help HRA understand why it's important to help out the person who is applying for rent arrears.
And just to add in real quick on that, I mean, a lot of times people will say, oh, well, I didn't have medical bills myself. I helped out my mom who lives in Georgia. Those are circumstances that HRA will consider. So, as you are evaluating, a case, you're trying to assist someone, like we do recommend to, be creative, like really explore, why they didn't have as much money available as before. And consider including those facts, even if it's not directly related to the individual's household expenses, because HRA understands family, right? Sometimes you have to press them a little more and try to convince them, but those things are relevant. And sorry, if anyone has the annotate function turned on, if they could just turn that off and remove the line that was put through the presentation, just take a look if you have it on, please. And then I'll go into this one. So this is just some of the terms. Before I said, we hear one-shot deal a lot. These actually are specific to different types of situations. So we'll just start with the client without an ongoing cash assistance case. So they don't receive monthly benefits from HRA. If they're going to apply for a rent arrears grant, they're going to have to interface with HRA to apply and get a case number. They're going to have to submit a full application for cash assistance, which can be pretty onerous. And then they're going to just check off that there is an emergency need for back rent. And HRA, I think, does this to make sure that they're capturing people who may not realize that they're eligible for full ongoing benefits. But it does mean that everyone ends up having to fill out the full cash assistance application. In these circumstances, advocates should submit a letter in support to the rental assistance unit. We'll have the email boxes later in the presentation for where to send those advocacy letters. And for clients in this situation where they don't have an ongoing cash assistance case, this is technically what is called a one-shot deal. For clients who already have ongoing cash assistance, to apply, the client themselves or an advocate can make an emergency request just using their case number. Similarly, we just always suggest that the advocate submits a letter in support to the rental assistance unit. And because this is not, this is a client who's getting ongoing benefits, it's not a one-shot deal, it's not a one-time issuance of money, it's a rent arrears grant on top of their monthly benefits.
So getting started, generally applications are processed at the HRA Job Center. If it's an emergency though, the application can be started at the courthouses. So once again, if you do have the annotation function, try and turn it off. Sometimes we're going through the screens and it might show up as another mark. Thanks everyone for your patience. So the courthouses and at some home-based sites and entry points into the shelter system, you can request information about how to apply for a rent arrears grant. So the process is actually completed at the job center, but there is a homebound exception. So for households where the person who is applying is unable to leave the house for a specific reason, there is a process that you can take with HRA to have someone either contact them over the phone or go to the household and process the information. Everyone over the age of 18 should be at the interview. So HRA requires that everyone who is an adult over the age of 18 be at the interview. Sometimes that is difficult, but it is unfortunately a requirement. HRA is supposed to process the application within 30 days. So for the most part, that has stayed true. But of course, with COVID, sometimes there are delays with processing applications. But I would say for the majority of most cases, then they do process the applications within 30 days.
So as Aissatou was saying, we generally we are now operating under slightly different circumstances. The prior slide indicates more what would happen before COVID. It's still possible to go into a job center to apply, but that's not typically recommended now. Thankfully, HRA has created alternate methods to apply and has been really focusing on increasing the efficiency, although there are obviously some ongoing, hiccups. So here, this slide is just the 4 ways to process an application during the pandemic in order of preference for getting the case open as soon as possible. So the first one is the new Access HRA either website or mobile app. If a client has access to Wi-Fi or the internet somewhere, although we generally don't recommend they connect to public networks to do this, they can go online and apply. And it's pretty straightforward so long as the client has the technological capacity to do that, because it does require, like I said, connecting to the internet, reading a lot of words in English and filling out information. It can be a little confusing, but if there are ways to follow along with them and answer questions while they're applying, it really is the fastest way to get a case open. So if at all possible, try to help clients apply this way. And you can, if you're doing the website, you can do the entire application and upload the documents in the same place. If they're doing the app, it's a little wonky. You have to download 2 apps. There's the Access HRA mobile app and then a separate app to upload the documents. I don't know why. They just have to download 2 apps to do that part. Technically, there are job centers that are still open if that is the only way that a client can apply. There are 7 in the city that are open. If they go in, though, they're going to be is actually directed to a computer to apply, just like they would online. So really, this is a situation where maybe if the client just doesn't have internet access and they still want to apply through Access HRA, like going to the job center, that's an option. And also submitting the documents, they can copy documents there. But it's not the typical, you go in, you sit down with a caseworker, they go through everything with you right now, because HRA is trying to also protect their staff. You can also request a paper application. This is typically pretty slow because it's, they mail it to you and then you have to mail everything back. And then finally, there is another option for homebound clients. So if someone has a disability or some sort of impairment that makes it impossible for them to apply in one of the other 3 ways, then HRA can actually do a homebound visit with someone. You can also, I don't think we have it on here, but you can call and are they considering all the calls like homebound visits?
I think so.
Okay.
The HRA info line should be able to help with that.
Okay, yeah. So you can actually call and apply online through the phone with someone. So what they're going to do is they're going to have a worker who puts you on a waiting list. And then once your name comes up on the waiting list, you're going to get a call from someone. They're going to have the website open on their end, and they're going to verbally walk the person through the application. You know, this was created because they're not really sending people out to apply to help, sending caseworkers out to clients' homes to apply like they would in the past. I think they're doing it in very limited circumstances. It's almost impossible. So they've created a process for all those folks who can't apply in the other 3 ways to call and then go through with someone on the phone, although there is, like we said, a wait list. And just know workers are calling from their cell phones, so there's no return phone number. So it's not like, if they miss the call from HRA, they're not going to have a return number that they can just like, oh, I'm going to call you back real quick. It's going to be, getting back on the wait list, making sure that someone's going to call you back. And then it's, also just getting the copies of the documents to HRA to open the application is taking a little bit longer through this phone process.
So HRA should be calling all clients who have submitted their applications back in 2 business days. Like Amber said, a worker will be calling most likely from their cell phones. They might not have a callback number listed and might not state a callback number on the voicemail. If your client does not get a callback within 2 business days, we should call the rescheduling unit to ensure that they got a phone call and to reschedule that phone call. We can also send an email to HRA to notify them of the fact that the client either didn't get a phone call or wasn't able to speak to someone who did call them. Sometimes you will have to deal with the regional offices for the borough and contact contact RAU for help. So their email is rauadvocatescases@hra.nyc.gov. If your client does not get a phone call, is unable to reschedule, request a fair hearing and do an advocate's inquiry. I would say as soon as possible, do not wait a month, because at that point in time, the case might be closed and the application process might have to start all over again. If your client does get a phone call and they are able to speak to someone, they should try and get that person's name. They won't get a public assistance case number at that time, but there'll be something like an application number. They should try and get that information, because sometimes the phone call isn't able to get all of the relevant information for the application. So if they can get a name and their application number, it will be easier for us to follow up with the RAU and figure out what's missing and figure out where we can assist.
And just real quick, I want to note that this callback within 2 business days is for all applications, not just the times when you're calling to submit the information. Anyone who submits an application online, for example, should get this callback within 2 business days, because it replaces what would be the interview in the job center. So everyone should be receiving a callback, and if the person who applies has not, we need to make sure to get, HRA on it as soon as possible. So call the info line on the previous slide. You can call the rescheduling unit on this slide. We just, if that 2 days has passed, it means that you need to do something, because, something has fallen through the cracks. We're not going to go through all of these. These are just the documents, you can use this for your reference, that you should help tenants gather when they are preparing to apply for cash assistance or one-shot deal case. So proving their identity, residence, who lives with them, how much they have to pay for their rent, if they have any money, sitting around somewhere in a bank account, and then, their immigration status. And remember, we get this question a lot. You do not have to be a citizen to get cash assistance or a one-shot deal. You don't even have to be a lawful permanent resident, right? You don't have to have a green card, as some people call it, or a permanent residency card. There are other immigration statuses where you are eligible for benefits. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to the Legal Aid Society. We have lots of materials that you can use to help figure out if you qualify or if someone you're helping qualifies.
So the documents concerning a rent arrears grant. You need proof that the client can stay in the apartment for at least a year after the arrears are paid. So normally that's shown through a lease. It can be shown through a court stipulation where in the stipulation it says that the tenant or the individual is able to stay in the apartment for a year. or another written agreement with the landlord. Sometimes that might be an email with the landlord's attorney, just something that states that the person who is applying can stay in the apartment. And I'll emphasize that that's not always the tenant of record, right? It might be another individual who was left after the tenant of record left the apartment. So it just needs to show that the person who's applying for arrears has permission from the landlord to stay in the apartment for at least a year. If the apartment is rent regulated, a 1-year lease agreement is not required, but the workers don't really understand how rent stabilization law works, and you might need to explain to them that if an individual has a lease in a rent stabilized apartment, they have a right to renew that lease. So that just might be something that you need to state to the caseworker on the case. Proof of the landlord's ownership, such as a deed or water bill, that's available through Acris. We have the link for the Acris site here. You can put in the address and you will be able to pull up the information that you need. Sometimes they write the categories. Housing court papers, right? So a rent demand, which as Amber explained, is a letter from the landlord explaining how much is owed and what dates it's owed for. A petition, which is the legal paperwork that a landlord files to start the case. A breakdown, which I know a lot of you have seen, which essentially is kind of like a ledger. It breaks down how much money is owed for each month and how much was paid. A stipulation, which is a court paper that either states the amount or is an agreement to pay the amount. A court order, which is something that's signed by the judge that explains what the next steps are or what the possible requirements of each party is. So something that we always add is an advocacy letter. It's something that we do on behalf of our clients. We demonstrate why this apartment should be saved for this family. Um, Showing ties to the community is probably the most important part. How long has the family lived in this apartment? How long do the kids go to school in the neighborhood? Do they have family in the neighborhood? Are the resources for the children in the household or even the adults in the household in the neighborhood, right? HRA likes the idea of keeping families together and keeping people in the communities where their resources are. So if you're able to highlight those types of situations in your advocacy letter, it can make it easier for the caseworker to approve the application. Proof that the client has at least 1 month of rent saved to demonstrate future ability. So normally when I have a rent arrears case and I know that I'm trying to get a grant, I tell my client immediately, I need you to save 1 month's rent for, and I'll say the next month. So for example, I'll say, I need you to save 1 month's rent for February. Can you get me that money order by January 31st? And have them go to the post office or a check cashing place and prepare a money order. Some rent arrears grants aren't approved until the caseworker can see proof of that. And a picture, I'll usually have a client text me a picture and then I'll forward that to the caseworker. A picture is usually enough of a money order that's filled out, right? You know, I would say rarely will they approve an application without that proof showing. So it's a really important part. And sometimes it's the last thing that you're able to get. But, you know, as soon as I send that email or send that picture with the money order, I'll get an approval within minutes. So they just really want to see that the next month's rent is covered.
And just to add on to the advocacy letter piece of it, again, as I was explaining with demonstrating expenses and why arrears are reasonable, be creative here, right? Like we have submitted advocacy letters where we talk about, if someone's religious institution is only a block away, and maybe they have difficulty traversing long distances, like if they have children and their after school programs are nearby, or their tutors, or their school who provides all kinds of services. If someone has an individual education plan, an IEP, so if there's a child that is receiving special services, and if they have to move out of the district, it's going to create an interruption and like the continuity of providing those services. Like it can be a lot of things. And so like the ties to the community, it's not just, I volunteer, I do this. It's really, think about what's necessary for someone's life, like their, religion is essential, education, healthcare. If someone, I've even in cases where a client had a child with diabetes, like just knowing that the area they were in had access to a grocery store which always had fresh fruits and vegetables versus, if they had to move to another neighborhood, which is sometimes a food desert where you don't frequently have large grocery stores. You only have bodegas, and so it's harder to get access to healthy food. Like those are things that I've put in advocacy letters to get one-shot deals approved. And we've talked about this a lot already, and we always talk about this because it is the single most important piece of a rent arrears grant application is demonstrating to HRA that the client, the applicant, is going to be able to pay their rent in the future, right? So we explain why they fell behind and explain why it's not going to happen again. So you're going to have to demonstrate that there is sufficient income in the household to pay the monthly rent going forward. And if you can't do that, there's not going to be any entity, HRA, a charity, that is going to give money for the rent arrears because they're going to assume that you're going to need money again, right? So that's why this part is the key piece to figure out before you submit a rent arrears grant application.
So how do you show this future ability to pay? A lot of people receive support like Social Security or cash assistance. That is any income that is coming into the household is relevant to showing that the household can afford to pay the rent in the future. Pay stubs. If a client is unable to get a pay stub, you can try and get an employment letter from whoever their employer is that states how many hours they work a week, how much they're paid for that rate, and how long they've been working there. So if the tenant has a subsidy, so we'll have tenants who have Section 8 or different types of Section 8, a subsidy letter, right, that shows what their share is in addition to their proof of income is necessary. If the tenant has a third party, so the third party can be any individual, but it's essentially a person who is willing and able to commit to paying a portion of the rent. It's usually a family member. For a lot of our elderly clients, it'll most likely be their child. If they are applying for a rent arrears grant or even if they're applying for a rent arrears grant, a third party can show their proof of income. So that would also be pay stubs or tax papers to show that they have the income to not only cover their own rent, but also the rent of the person who they're attempting to assist. But we do want to clarify that this is specifically for future ability for a rent arrears grant. If you're applying for FEPS or CityFEPS, you cannot have a third party, someone who is outside of the household, but you can have roommates within the household who contribute to the rent amount. So there's a difference between the two, but the third party for a rent arrears grant does not have to be a roommate. It can be someone who does not live within the household. Amber, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. As Stu already said, demonstrating that your client has, at least 1 month's rent, either taking a picture of that money order, that is frequently the deciding factor in getting that the rent arrears grant approved quickly. Like they'll hold it, they won't move on it. They'll tell you follow up with us afterwards, and then the second you get it in, you might get that application approved a few minutes later. Um, before COVID, HRA would try to get the client to come up with additional money sometimes if the arrears were significant, like any situation where you're over $10,000, they would say, well, go to home base, try to get charity funds. Like, where's your tax return? Have you asked, friends or family for money? Um, they're doing it less for some of the, middle, lower arrears cases, but for ones that are really high, they are still saying, we don't want to approve all of this. Go to home base, go to a charity, see what they'll give you, and then come back to us and let us know, and then we'll approve, possibly after that. One thing to pay attention to, because we get this question a lot, is about money from home base, because money from home base frequently comes out of the same pot of money that HRA uses to pay arrears. So they don't necessarily want home base money unless it's from their private funds. In certain types of cases, they'll let you know, but it is something, they say, I don't want the home base money, go somewhere else. It's usually because they would be approving the rent arrears grant through HRA from the same pot of money that home base is using. Again, the larger arrears, the more HRA is going to want from a client. So, once you are doing those cases over $10,000, like 1 month might not be enough. They might say, like, we want to see another $1,000, go to a charity. We want to see another $3,000. It really just depends on the individual circumstances of the case. Like, for example, if someone fell behind and it happens, but there's no one in the household who has significant ties to the community. They don't, there's no one who has a disability. There's no one who's older. They're going to say, well, go get some more money from charities, versus someone who has very sympathetic factors. They might be willing to approve a higher rent arrears grant without having them run around to try and find additional money to contribute on top of that 1 month's rent. And then also note, I have gotten rent arrears grants approved where I don't have the 1 month's contribution, but it's usually because my client has just made a large payment directly to the landlord. So if I have a breakdown that shows they just made that like 3 days ago, like they can't come up with another month because they just paid this month, right? That can be sufficient to demonstrate the client contribution.
So, a practice tip when to apply. A big part of applying for rent arrears grants is timing, right? So, because showing future ability is such an important aspect of the rent arrears grant application, you might delay giving in the application to figure out all of the other details, get all of the paperwork, but tell your client immediately, like I said before, that you're gonna need 1 month's rent, right? So having your client get that money order as soon as possible. But pre-COVID, we would have the client bring the rent to our office so that we can put it in a safe, right? And it would be dated for the first of the month of the upcoming month. But because HRA limits the amount of time that they're looking at a rent arrears application, it's important that time doesn't run out after the HRA paperwork is submitted and after the phone call happens, right? So if it's early in the month, right, and the client's income and information and the money order has been received, you can apply. But if you don't have everything yet and it's coming up to the end of the month, it's better to apply at the beginning of the next month so that you would also be able to apply for that month's rent. So that the client would be able to have the next month's rent covered. So let's say, for example, I'm approaching the end of January and my client still doesn't have their 1 month's rent, but they think that they can have it to me by February 2nd. I would delay submitting the application until February, because if they have a money order by February 2nd, we can use that money order for March rent. So it's a little bit of strategy, but it's important to try and protect our clients and the applicants as much as possible where it comes to the possibility of falling back into arrears.
And one thing this tip is really helpful for is figuring out future ability for clients who have Social Security, because frequently they get their checks, you know, the 15th, the third week of the month. And so they're always behind because they never, like, they don't have the money on the first. They have it on, you know, the 22nd of every month. So if you're going to apply for a rent arrears grant, even if they get you the money, you know, say that third week of, say, we'll say February, um, and you apply and you apply, they're going to apply that contribution towards February, which means that the tenant is going to be immediately back behind again for the next month because they're not going to get their rent until, you know, the third week of March. So for clients who have Social Security, you know, I'll talk to them and say we could submit it now, but just so you know, like we're only going to be the arrears through February, and so in March, you know, you're going to fall, yeah, you're not going to have the money to pay for March again. What we could do, and sometimes it's a risk, is to wait and ask for a slightly bigger amount from HRA and apply, you know, that money you gave me in February to March rent, so that when March, you know, your March Social Security comes in, then you can take that and apply it to April rent. So then you're avoiding, you know, late fees being added to the client's bill, you know, in the future. It's just, you know, you have to think about how much the arrears are and, you know, make sure the client knows that it does increase risk a little bit if the arrears are substantial. And you might have to end up applying it to February anyway. But it is something, you know, to think about, to maybe try and set up the client for the future. For this one, HRA is going to ask the applicant to use all available resources. So this means their tax return, if it's, and especially if it's the first half of the year, they're going to say, well, have you applied for your tax return yet? If it's January, not so much, but by February, March, April, May, they're definitely asking, you know, did you do your taxes? How much did you get? What happened to your tax return? And if you're waiting for it, they might delay the application a little bit and say, like, let's just see how much you get for your tax return, and then we'll figure out, like, if we need to give you money on top of that, because they will ask clients to use their entire tax return to pay their arrears. They will also ask, you know, if you have any savings accounts, to use any money you have set aside to pay your arrears. And they have access to bank records. So they will be able to tell that you have a savings account at Apple Savings Bank or at Chase Bank that has $1,000 in it. And they're going to say, use that $1,000, you know, towards your arrears. Sometimes they do identify bank accounts that don't actually belong to your client, which is frustrating, especially common for people who maybe if they had a bank account that they never, like, they didn't know about, they forgot about it, or their name is similar to someone else's name. It's very frustrating, but you can, what you'll need to do is just, you know, send the client to the bank to get a letter stating that, like, the account that HRA identified is not actually their account, and then HRA will process the rent arrears grant. And then also, if the applicant owns their apartment, HRA will generally require that a lien be placed on the property for if it's so that if the property is sold, HRA gets its money back before your client gets the rest of the money from the sale. I think we had a question about grants. Is HRA making clients repay the one-shot deal grants? As we said before, it depends on how they approve it. Sometimes they approve what's called what's just a straight grant, which is money you don't have to pay back. And sometimes it's a loan. We'll go into the different types of approvals later in the presentation. So if you have questions about when it's going to be a loan, when it's going to be a grant after that, just let us know.
So the role of the advocate, I will say before I get into this part, is that some tenants apply for one-shot deals and they're able to get them on their own. And they're able to use the HRA app, answer the phone call, get all the information in. But usually those are the applicants who are a little bit more tech savvy. So a lot of our clients need an advocate to help them through the process. and just make sure that nothing falls through the cracks with HRA. It's extremely helpful if you can help a tenant organize a persuasive packet for their rent arrears grant application. So the advocate can provide a cover letter, basically setting out the best facts in a logical way. HRA is used to advocate letters, so they know what information we are seeking to tell them. It's also important to follow up with HRA, Homebase, or the charity that you're working with to make sure that the application doesn't fall through the cracks. Some information that you might try and get from your client is if they do get a phone call from HRA, they should try and get the name of the person they're speaking to. If they have an application number, what that application number is. Who is the caseworker they should follow up with. Even if your client doesn't have an email or doesn't have access to a phone, if they get a phone number, if they get an email address, all that information could be helpful for you to advocate for them. And you can also help them collect the information or present the information that they have to collect in a way where we can make sure that HRA or any other organization receives it. Because sometimes caseworkers will ask for emails. We can get text messages of the information that our clients need to provide and then provide all of that together at one time in an email to HRA. If you thoroughly prepare your client, for example, I had an intake last week and my client is eligible for a rent arrears grant. So I had a really long conversation with her about all of the documents that she needs. Follow up with her this week. Hi, what's their status on getting all of the documents? So you can make sure that they have all of the preparation that they need in order to submit the best application possible so that their application can also be processed quickly. And then you're able to troubleshoot problems that arise. If you know the name of the caseworker that your client is working with, you can shoot them an email, give them a phone call, and figure out specifically what's missing and what's the quickest way you can get that. Sometimes we are a liaison between the clients and the organizations that are providing the assistance. So it's something that we can do to help smooth out the process and make sure that everything happens as quickly as possible.
So there are, frequently clients who will come and, they have had prior one-shot deals. As we've talked about, one of the biggest requirements for the one-shot deal is future ability to pay rent. And we now, if they're coming back and they are in arrears, we've demonstrated essentially that, the prior one-shot grant, they didn't actually have future ability to pay rent. So how do you deal with that situation? First, if you have access to HRA records, if you are working with an agency where you have that permission, get a printout for at least the last 5 years to see if there were any prior rent arrears grants. And if there is a prior rent arrears grant, it doesn't mean that they're not going to get approved. It just means you're going to have to deal with it and figure out how to explain it. And it's going to be, probably more advocacy, more explanation, more justification than in prior applications, but it is not a bar. Like I've had people come to me and I said, oh, I can't get a one-shot deal because I had one last year. It doesn't work like that. It just means it's harder, not impossible. So if your client has received a rent arrears grant, especially for the past 2 or 3 years in a row, HRA is going to want the rent to be sent directly to the landlord in these cases if they're going to approve. So this is generally going to be, if the landlord has an online banking system to set up the proof that you've set up the automatic payments where the landlord is going to withdraw the money on a certain date. Sometimes it's going to the bank to set up an automatic check payment for a small fee. This doesn't happen that often, but we just put it here so that you are aware that in situations where there are successive one-shot deal approvals in the past 5 years, like I'd say, generally not 2, but once you get into 3, they're probably going to ask about this. It can be a little tricky to set up and take some time. And if you have questions about it, our email addresses are on this presentation. You can always reach out to us. We have a lot of folks that are even more experienced than we are in dealing with HRA issues and advocating with them to get the best outcomes for.
So an advocacy letter. So if you are an advocate, you should prepare a cover letter explaining all of the circumstances. First, make sure that you make clear that the applicant is eligible for a rent arrears grant. And if you anticipate any issues, for example, if there were any recent one-shot deals, explain why this situation is different. Also, make sure that you explain all of the sympathetic factors that are relevant that support why the applicant's application should be approved. The packet should contain all of the relevant documents, including the proof of the client's contribution. So that means the money order. One thing is that a lot of clients will have already submitted their application if they're using the HRA portal through Access HRA, or if they're applying online. I like to submit those documents as well because you never know what happens on the internet, right? So you never know what documents might be missing. I submit all of the documents that my client has already submitted just to fast track the process. And then you can submit the application using the RAU, Rental Assistance Unit email that we put before. So the packet, you can email directly to them, and they usually respond, I would say, within 3 days to 1 week, depending on the amount of money and depending what time of year it is and how busy they are. But if you don't get a response within a week, I would resubmit or send an email to that same email address explaining that you've submitted an application and you are requesting a status update. Yeah, so making sure that all of the documents that your client submitted is in, and also letting them know how they can follow up with you, right? Is that email? Is that cell phone? Some of them do like to communicate over the phone. So if you do have a phone number that you have access to for work during the day, please provide that phone number because then it will be easier and faster for them to handle any issues that they think exist.
So this part at the interview, this generally applies, or everyone's going to have an interview. In the past, your client would have an application caseworker at the center who would sit down with the client, go through all the materials, and create a list of documents they needed to bring in if they didn't have anything. They would do, the signatures from all the people over 18. But that's not happening anymore. Now the client's going to receive that call back, hopefully within 2 business days. And like we said, if it doesn't happen within 2 days, make sure to follow up. And the caseworker is going to go over the application and then do any signing off that they still need to do. We'll say this a few times, but always remember your client is entitled to an interpreter or reasonable accommodations. In my experience, they don't always make it clear, even if it's very apparent that someone is struggling with comprehension in English, that the person can request an interpreter in their primary language. So I like to remind my clients, especially if English is not their primary speaking language, if they want to do it in English and try, that's obviously fine. But they have a right to have it interpreted to them. And so they don't need to wait for the HRA caseworker to offer it to them. They can immediately say up front, I need, an interpreter for Bengali. I need an interpreter for Spanish. That's fine. And then a person can also be seen at home, like we said before. You call the same number, the info line, to request a homebound visit. In the past, this would happen a lot more frequently, but because of COVID, HRA is trying everything it can to avoid having to send their workers to someone's home just because of the risk of exposure. So they will try to do a call for the entire application if that's possible.
So the duty to assist. If documentation isn't available to the applicant, um, HRA has a duty to try and find that information that they're seeking. So usually at that initial phone call, HRA will request certain documentation, and that's not the only opportunity that the applicant has to submit that list of documents, right? But especially now during the time of quarantine for COVID-19, the agency's duty to assist is even bigger in order to protect the applicants from any type of negative effects of COVID-19. So they have access to a lot of databases. They have a lot of contacts that they can reach out to in order to get the information that they're requesting. It's not as simple as having a client go to the Social Security Administration office anymore. There's a lot of, or, just going to the school and getting information about their child's class schedule, right? There's a lot of information that HRA will have, and you can also request that they be a little bit more flexible with the proof that they're requesting, right? So they'll have a list of preferred documents, but even if you don't necessarily have that preferred document, you might be able, and this is where the role of an advocate is really important. You might be able to say, what, we don't have this information for unemployment, but here is a printout from the website that shows that our client is receiving this amount in unemployment, right? Or here is a redacted bank statement that shows the income that they are receiving from their employer because they don't get pay stubs and they're unable to get a letter. So this is where the duty to assist is not only in finding information, but I guess it's also in receiving information. They do understand that it's much more difficult to get access to paper documents that are more traditional forms of proof. So definitely, if you do find them pushing back on that, you push back as well, just as long as you're actually providing, legitimate information. They do have a duty to take what they're getting at face value.
And here's just, this is for you to keep for your records. These are the numbers and contact information for the Office of Constituent Services, and they are responsible for ensuring that folks who need to interface with HRA and also need reasonable accommodations get the services or accommodations that they need. You should get a case number from the Office of Constituent Services. I usually like to email them and then follow up within like a day with a phone call just to make sure that they got what got the information that I sent them. They, this office does try to do a good job of connecting folks, but they get a lot of requests. So again, as always, with I think everything that we're going to say at HRA, follow up. Don't wait more than a few days to make sure that they got the information if they haven't acknowledged anything that you've sent them. I can do this one real quick. So yeah, this doesn't apply during COVID because the centers aren't open. But we talked before about the the role of an advocate and making sure that a client is prepared to interface with HRA workers. So we're going to talk a little bit about the interview in general, but if we go back to normal times, it also matters about like what's going to happen at the welfare center, how long it's going to take. We always try to warn our clients that they could be at the welfare center for the job center for many hours. I mean, it could be upwards of 4, 5, 6. I mean, you can never predict it. It's very unfortunate that these applications can take so long. So if the client has children who go to school, preparing them also, is making sure that they know about the time that they might be there, so they can make arrangements to have someone else pick the kids up from school. They might be able to go earlier in the day versus later to try and strategize. We tell people not to go on Mondays because lots of people are like, okay, I'm just gonna go first thing Monday. Everyone goes, the line is long, it takes forever. Also, if you go the first day of the month or the last day of the month, because people have that, okay, I'm gonna get this done absolutely before the end of the month, or like it's the first of the month, I'm gonna do it and get it over with. Like that mentality is real, which translates into real wait time. So we try to tell people, go Tuesday to Friday, try to get there as early as possible so you can get in line because people will go before lunch or right after lunch. Just little things that can help the experience be a little bit easier.
So preparing for the client interview, pre-COVID, going to the center is not a pleasant experience, right? But the new callback process is not that much better. So your client is expected to be able to answer a lot of questions that they may not have answers to at that moment. So prepare them, let them know that they'll be getting a phone call. Some clients get their phone call really late at night, like 8 p.m. They're not expecting a business phone call at 8 p.m., right? From a strange number that they've never seen before. But prepare your client to be able to explain why they are in arrears and why they now have future ability. So if it's not a clear showing, right? HRA will request more information about why they should be approving the rent arrears grant. So you can help the client explain how they fell behind and why it won't happen again. But also, I'll say the interview is not the end all be all. We still have the opportunity to do the advocate's letter. We still have the opportunity to follow up. So even if your client is feeling dejected after that phone call, or if they missed the phone call, let them know, if you are an advocate, that you're able to continue the process with them and advocate on their behalf.
Yeah, and just as a side note, like I've had a few clients who were just very nervous with the idea of interacting with like anyone in the government, like HRA workers. Like, we deal with them every day. Like they're people, right? Like we've had arguments. We ask them how they're doing. Like you might know about their kids or like their mom or something. Our clients don't have that relationship or that experience. I mean, it's just like sometimes it's just someone from the government who is going to determine whether or not I can stay in my home. It is scary. I've done like practice interviews a few times with clients. If I could tell that they were very nervous, so like taking 15 minutes to, first explain like you might get someone nice, you might get someone who is super aggressive. It doesn't happen that often, but every once in a while there is someone who's kind of mean. And preparing your client to make sure that they deserve recognition of their own humanity, which isn't always given to them at HRA, and that they can, like, there's no experience that like doesn't justify like explaining you know how do I say this, there are all kinds of reasons that people fall behind. Explaining that HRA caseworkers have heard everything, like they don't need to be embarrassed. They don't need, they, if they feel that way, it's recognize it, but also make them comfortable to say that like they're not, like, most of them aren't going to be out there judging because you spent money on school supplies, right? Just like going through and making them comfortable explaining why, and affirming that it's okay because everyone deals with this stuff, and that's what we're here for. And then I had one client who wanted me to like practice being aggressive. It was hard for me, but I did it. It's like, well, how come you did this and how come you did that? If a client needs it, just do it because it means that it's going to be a better experience for them with HRA. And it's not that hard for us to figure out the questions.
So we have 3 contact points for you here. The first one is for 2 attorney stipulations from court. So more recently, you may not have these because since the new year, all court cases have been adjourned to after February 25th. But if you do have a stipulation from court where 2 attorneys have signed, you can send the information to attorney case settlement at hra.nyc.gov. Any other correspondence that you have with RAU, which is the unit that deals with arrears, email RAU advocates cases at hra.nyc.gov. So sometimes you might need a printout, which will give the benefits information for all clients. And you can request a printout at LOSU printouts at hra.nyc.gov. Make sure when you are requesting a housing report, provide the name, the client's case number, and the time frame of when you want the client's benefits information. You can use a printout to see if your client says, oh, I got a one-shot deal in 2020, maybe it was January, maybe it was February, but they're not sure. You can use a printout to get that information. Or if they say, I think I got FEPS, or I think I get food stamps, getting food stamps can help support a rental RAU application for arrears, because that's proof that they can possibly pay for their food as well, right? So you can request a printout, which will provide that information at those emails.
So the next few slides are mostly for your reference, because it won't matter most times, who's handling the application and at what stage. But just so you know, in 2013, there was a new policy issued addressing which, when we say shelter related requests, I mean like rent type requests are handled by the job center and which are handled centrally downtown. So there are 3 units to be aware of. There is the case management unit, which is located in the individual job centers. There's the homelessness or the homeless diversion unit, which is also in each job center. Then there is a centralized rental assistance unit, which is located downtown in Manhattan.
So the Bureau of Eligibility Verification, also notoriously known as BEV, right? So normally pre-COVID, a client might be sent to a BEV interview to confirm a lot of the information that they said in their initial interview at the HRA Job Center and to provide documentation for their one-shot application, but they are suspended. Those interviews are suspended. Questioning is usually done by 1 or 2 BEV workers to an applicant. Preparing for that questioning is very important. The client must bring all the documentation with them and the advocacy letter again. So the worker wants to see, they have a list of things that they want to see, right? So whether it's a lease, court papers, a breakdown, a bill showing that that is their address, the workers have requirements that they are told they need to follow. In saying that, it's also important to note that the workers know about fraud and they have a list of things that tell them how to do their job, but they aren't experts about welfare eligibility, right? So sometimes they might say things that will confuse our clients or dissuade our clients from continuing with their applications. And that can be very frustrating, but that's why it's important to also, as an advocate, know what the rights and responsibilities of individuals who are receiving benefits are.
So again, BV appointments are suspended during COVID-19, but if we get back to regular practice and they continue with these appointments, they might schedule a second appointment for a home visit. It's usually 1 to 3 weeks after that first appointment. If there is a pending housing court case, they are supposed to jump the line and get handled first. So if there is a deadline in the housing court case, like the pay date is, on the 31st and it's now the 20th, make sure HRA is aware of those dates because they will, you know, try to place the person in line to get the visit done before whatever date is upcoming. The client must be home during the home visit. If not, the application is generally denied, and then you have to start all over again. I think I've been successful once when this came up. I haven't had it come up a whole lot, but one time, and it was because the notice that they got was not the time that they came, and so it wasn't the client's fault. But they will almost always have to start over unless there's some sort of quirk like that.
So conditional approvals. So pre-COVID, RAU would issue a conditional approval before a BEV appointment, but they'll rarely do so. So it's usually in more emergency cases where we've submitted the advocacy letter that with all of the attachments, but they still haven't met the requirement of going to their BEV appointment. RAU might send a conditional approval via email. But under Social Security, social services regulations, these appointments must not delay an eligibility determination process beyond the timeframes established by social services law. So that's an important piece to remember in if we ever go to a different time where BEV appointments return, that they shouldn't be delaying the conditional approvals.
Okay, and this is just the chain of command within the job centers. Keep this just so you know. You have where the applications start, the supervisor, um, the office manager, and then directors and above. Generally, if you are within an organization like a legal services organization or a community-based organization that does applications regularly, you will have been given permission to contact the directors to handle issues. These are not numbers that are given out to everyone. So, make sure to reference, your training materials or speak to people within your organization for your rules about how to go up the chain. I think everyone handles it a little bit differently. But HRA has told us that if the staff don't get back to you within 1 to 3 days, and particularly if there's an emergency, go directly to the regional staff because they understand that they don't want people getting evicted because of their delay. So keep that in mind, and as we keep saying, follow up, follow up.
And the same applies for RAU, right? So RAU is under the Homelessness Prevention Administration, HPA. So there will be an RAU worker. They'll have a supervisor, and then Auntie McKinday and John Foria are the director and deputy director. Elena Cabrera will also be on a lot of emails, Greg Gomez, and the chief homelessness prevention officer is Bruce Jordan. So as Amber stated before, if you work at an organization that does the type of homelessness prevention work that we do, you will have access to these individuals' emails and phone numbers as well. But if you don't, email your supervisor or someone at your organization, and they should be able to provide that information to you. It's not information that's available for the public, so please make sure to deal with that information responsibly.
And I see that we have quite a few application or questions in the chat, so I think I'm going to take a quick pause to go through some of them.
Sounds good.
So I see a comment. Sadly, the vast majority of my clients complain to me about the poor way that they are treated at HRA. The clients feel demeaned. This is a culture that is projected to the community. My questions are HRA staff trained to be empathetic and act professionally? How can a client file a complaint? And if they file a complaint, how will that affect the quality of assistance that the client is seeking? My answer to that is we hear the same thing. I've even been to a job center with a client before just because they felt so unsafe with the caseworker that they were assigned to. HRA did not like that. The caseworker did not like that, but eventually, they processed the application. we really like to focus on preparing our clients as much as possible. It really is unfortunate that we are frequently in the position of preparing someone to feel dehumanized and how to deal with that emotionally. It is difficult, it is not fun, and it's not great. I do think that a little emotional because there's so many, after doing this for 6 years, there are so many clients that I've heard, say similar things. To a certain extent, I think that there are job centers that are better than others. I think it really depends on the individual location. It also depends on whether or not that center has been retrained. I can tell you that I had at least one client who was repeatedly turned away because she did not have lawful permanent resident status. And as we said before, that is not a requirement. Like, there are other types of immigration statuses where someone is eligible. So that entire office had to be retrained on immigration eligibility, and we did that through a complaint with through the Legal Aid Society, making an official complaint to HRA. With respect to just individual disagreements or poor behavior from HRA case worker staff, if you are at an organization, typically you'll have a policy for how to deal with that and to what level of intervention that you want to make, and giving the clients information about how to make complaints. So, just follow your organization. I can't, tell you, every case you should do X, because it really is a case by case determination. Let's see. We answer the question about contacts. Each organization should have a list of people that they are authorized to contact and in what order. So, legal aid might have a different process than another organization. So, just check internally. We have a question. If someone has a disability and saves money for medical reasons, will HRA take that money out of savings for arrears? This is tricky, right? Because if it's just in a regular bank account, not in sort of, some sort of health savings account, they might ask for it. It also might be a situation where you could ask for an exception. So that is really fact-based. But I think it's something that's worth trying. I can't tell you if it would be successful, but I do think it's something that's reasonable to ask them if you can, justify ongoing medical expenses. And like, say insulin, like you break a vial and you don't have $700, what are you going to do? Who knows? But I think it's worth it.
And I would say a way to do that possibly is to, if they have had previous bills for the year before, yes, it's a little personal, but if they can show that they did use whatever they had saved previously to pay for those medical expenses, and they anticipate the same type of situation this year, I think that might help.
And then someone asked, what is a housing report? Is that an HRA history record? Yeah, everyone calls it something different. It's, it shows their budget, it shows what payments were issued for which periods, any sort of sanction history, things like that. How do you request that information? So we have the link on the slide. So I believe that's a bunch of questions for now. If I missed you, please type your question in again, and we'll move forward.
So what, go ahead.
So if the application is denied, what do you do? First, don't assume the denial is permanent. You can submit a reconsideration. You should do a full reconsideration packet and address all the points in the denial and provide supporting documentation. It's best if you do this within 25 days, because after 30 days, they will make the client reapply and go through the entire thing again. That's why it's important to make sure to follow up with the rental assistance unit if they haven't responded to your initial application. And when I say within 25 days, I mean 25 days from the initial application, not the denial, because all one-shot deal and rent arrears grants are supposed to be handled within 30 days. So that's the marker for when they're going to make you reapply. So don't sit on a case. Like I said, I think it's pretty reasonable to follow up with RAU within 2 to 3 days. If it is an emergency case, like, I mean, obviously right now, few people are getting evicted, so they might be less willing to deal with you if you are submitting, questions and follow-up emails every day. But if you have someone who's in a post-evict situation, if you have someone who has the final judgment, and they only have, another week to pay before a notice can be a marshal's notice can be issued, like they understand why you were bugging them, and they might get annoyed, but they're not going to do anything detrimental in the case just for you being annoying. Yeah, work on resolving the weaknesses. If the application is denied and you don't have the ability to correct within the 30 days, you're going to have to submit a new circumstance once you have a new application once you have proof that the circumstances have changed. So like I've had situations where someone was, laid off for a month, in the middle of the one-shot deal process. And they, got a new job a month later, but it'd been more than 30 days and we just had to reapply. It's There's really no getting around that. We do think it's best to avoid fair hearings about rent, just because it's usually faster to do the new application than go through the entire fair hearing process. And there's no like penalty for reapplying for the denial. Like HRA knows why you do it. But we do say, like, you should do fair hearings for like regular budgeting issues. So someone wasn't getting the full shelter because their income was improperly budgeted, they were sanctioned, and for some reason the center just won't fix it when you reach out to them, and it's time to do a fair hearing.
So, what if the application is approved? First, congratulations, but make sure that the approval includes all of the arrears that you requested. If not, respond to the RAU unit immediately and ask them to reconsider the whole amount. Um, Contact the Central Rent Processing Unit, which is known as CRPU, to have them hold the checks for pickup. But during COVID, most checks are mailed to the landlord. So, a step you might take after you submit the application, but before the application is approved, is confirming with the tenant or the landlord what the correct address to mail checks are. Um, if you don't ask for pickup, the checks will be sent directly to the landlord. So if you do want pickup during COVID, it's important that you say that in all of the emails that you send to RAU and CRPU. You want to be able to use the checks to discontinue a case if there is one. So if after the checks are mailed out, you can reach out to the landlord or the landlord's attorney to confirm that they've received the checks so that the case can be ended. Checks can be picked up during COVID, but their office, CRPU's office, which is near Union Square, is only open a few days a week and only available for pickup by an advocate. So uh, an advocacy organization or a landlord during certain periods of time. And you have to set that up with the CRPU unit as well. The fastest way to get the checks is to have them mailed directly to the landlord at this point in time. And they usually try and do that within 1 day of the approval once once CRPU receives notice of the approval. Oh, Amber, you're on mute.
Sorry, I have someone in the background who's speaking, so I keep muting myself. So CRPU sends the checks directly, which they're pretty much all doing now. Just get a new printout to request where the checks went if they don't tell you in the approval email. Pre-COVID, they were often sent by certified mail when they did send them. During COVID, they are mostly sent by regular mail to the landlord unless it's an emergency case. Except last week we did hear that HRA started just saying yes when we asked for the checks to be sent by certified mail. So it's much better to send by certified mail because you can figure out when they get there, which will help you figure out when you can actually end the case. So if you do get an approval and the checks are sent, right when you get that approval, I would say start asking for the checks to be sent by certified mail, just to give an extra layer of security. And that's because sometimes they mail the checks to the wrong landlord or addresses. They can get cashed. I'm not really sure how, but it happens with alarming frequency in these cases where they're mailed to the wrong place. So request an updated printout to see where they're issued. And also, if it's been a few weeks and you haven't heard, see if they've been cashed. So you'll get a new printout to see if we're not doing reading printouts, but if the status of the check has changed to the cashed status.
So most arrears are a loan. It's very important to explain to your client that money from HRA for arrears is usually a loan above what the household will receive if they were receiving cash assistance. And we'll go over what that looks like. So there are two shelter allowance schedules for households. Households with minor children, that means someone in the household is under the age of 18 or under the age of 19 and is still in a high school or high school equivalent program. The other type of household is a household without any minor children. So examples of that would be singles, couples, and all adult families. Right. So the two unrelated households living together can each obtain back rent. So a household is more of a concept. So two households can be technically under the same roof. And we also have handouts in the material that we provided that explains when there is a possibility that the arrears would be considered a loan.
Okay, so for this part, this is mostly for reference. As we discussed before, when you're doing future ability to pay the rent, HRA doesn't expect people to have a ton of money left over after they pay their rent. Really, they just want to make sure that they have at least the amount that someone who is receiving ongoing benefits gets in their what's called food and other, the cash portion of their grant. So for a household of one, you want to see if you can, explain future ability in a way that shows that they have, around $180 left over after paying their rent. And, if it's also really helpful to point out in these cases that the household is receiving food stamps, because then HRA, I think, feels more comfortable approving when, someone has very little left over, because they can at least make sure they're going to be able to eat. So they're not going to be as food insecure. And, the amount goes up with the more people that are in the household. Yeah, this is, and just to note, there are, oh, sorry. There are two different amounts. So there's households with minor children and households without minor children. So households with minor children get more money. So they're going to require a larger amount of money left over after paying their rent to approve the rent arrears grant.
So the types of rent arrears grant. So there's the Emergency Assistance to Needy Families, EAF. So that means that there are minors in the household and there was an unforeseen and uncontrollable event. The income is at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, and the type of grant will usually be up to 6 months of rent. And they state that for the one shot, it's once every 5 years. However, we know that COVID has changed a lot of things, and even pre-COVID, a couple of times, not bragging, but I was able to get a couple of one-shot deals within less than 5 years. Payback, yes, if the amount is above the shelter allowance, right? And we also have a copy of this chart available to you all. Additional factors, right? So there are no sanctions, no refusal of work, right? And sympathetic factors. So no sanction essentially means that they met all of the requirements for reporting information to HRA, that there is no adult in the household who has refused to work. And we discussed sympathetic factors before. So there's also emergency assistance to adults, right? So that would include arrears and utility shutoffs. The income is SSI, and the amount that they will agree to pay is normally 4 months prior to the application. So these duration amounts are what they typically do, not saying that there are no exceptions. Payback, no. And additional factors, it's considered once a year, unless there's a new emergency that arises for that adult. There's also the emergency safety net assistance. So that's emergencies for arrears or utility shutoffs. And the income for the household needs to be at or below 125% of the federal poverty level if there are no unforeseen emergencies, right? So that's an exception. They'll take into consideration unforeseen emergencies to raise the requirements. The duration that they have listed is up to 6 months of arrears once every 5 years. And that household is expected to pay the entire amount back in 1 to 2 years. Um, and if they have sanctions, the sanction share must be covered by a charity. So HRA will not pay for an amount that the household was supposed to receive, but didn't receive because they didn't report certain information. And you can usually figure out through a housing court report, a printout, what those sanctions are and how they affected, or what that amount might look like. So there's also the exception to policy grant. Yes, there are these categories, but there are so many more different types of households out there. There are households that receive a subsidy from HRA already, such as FEPS, CityFEPS, TBRA, HASA. There are also households that receive Section 8, or households that have subsidized income because they live in NYCHA, right? So for those, the rules are at HRA's discretion, but you still try and submit the best application possible and still try and advocate as strongly as possible for the client.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here a little bit because this part of rent arrears grants I think was the most complicated for me to get and to figure out going forward. And, and and really that's because you don't actually need to know any of this to apply for a rent arrears grant. Someone just applying by themselves without an advocate, like they just apply, I have a back rent emergency rent need, and then HRA looks at what they present, and then the caseworker will compare it against these grants and then decide which one they're going to approve it under. It's important for advocates to know because we want to maximize the amount of money that clients get that's a true grant that they don't have to pay back. So we want to make sure that when HRA approves it, they're actually approving as little as possible that it's a loan and as most as possible as a grant. So the way I learned to think about these, the ones, the EAF, the EAA, the ESNA, these are all ones that are in state law, right? Everyone in the entire, state of New York can apply for these. It's not just people in New York City. And so you think about these are, the state's stricter than the city is. So they don't like to give a ton of money and they don't like to, give frequently. So if they're going to, get approved under EAF, the max they're going to get is 6 months. And if they apply next year, they're not going to get an EAF grant. They might get a grant that's an exception to policy. So it doesn't mean that someone who's in the EAF category can't apply again and can't get an approval again. It just means they're not going to get that state approval. They're not going to get that state money. They're going to get, if it's going to be approved, it's going to be approved under either one of the other ones or as an exception to policy grant by HRA. So HRA pretty much, they're almost always loans. So that's why, that first instance, they'll say approval EAF, for, you know, say it's like you're asking for $1,000. It's a household of one, single adult. That means that they have a shelter allowance of 215. So 215 is going to be a grant. They're not going to have to pay that back. That difference between 215 and $1,000, that's the amount that's going to be a loan, unfortunately. But in the next year, you know, if they fall behind again and need an additional $1,000, for example, it's going to be approved under exception to policy, and it's probably all going to be a loan. So that's just kind of a way to think about it. If you have the capacity to try, you know, and your organization asks you to do this, I think really it is a good idea to try and make sure as possible is a grant, so they don't have to pay back, because they have ongoing cash assistance. They're going to be recouped forever. We want to avoid that if we can. I think we can just, I mean, this is essentially a breakdown of the prior slide. You can use this for your reference, but we won't go over every piece of it. Oh yeah, and so along with what I was saying before, this practice tip is, it really goes to trying to reduce the amount of money that your client's gonna have to pay back. So if client has ongoing benefits, try to see if there were any errors in the cash assistance case that is gonna reduce the amount sought in the application. So, you know, if $1,000 is what you need to pay back, and for whatever reason, you know, HRA didn't issue the shelter payment for, you know, last month, go to the job center to get those checks reissued. And if it's, you know, a family of, what is it, three, you get $400. Now you're only asking for $600. So they might only have to pay back $600 instead of $1,000. You know, you might see that checks have gone stale. They've been outstanding for more than, was it 6 months? HRA checks are good for. So, you know, sometimes landlords just don't cash a check. They like leave it in the PO box, like they lose it. Who knows what happened to it? But if it's gone stale, it's been more than 6 months, the center will reissue it because the client was still entitled to that money, right? So like it doesn't need to be a loan because it's money they should have already gotten. Um, Same with, you know, if they were counting too much income. Client lost their job, they submitted the papers to HRA and they never fixed the budget. Maybe they should have got an extra $50 per month. We don't know. So, you know, really dig into the cash assistance case to make sure that you're maximizing every dollar for the client. And yeah, like I said, you go to the center for these to get reissued. They'll get sent directly to the landlord.
Other circumstances. So there are other resources that are available to individuals with housing. So HRA will also assist with relocation. So you'll see this in situations where in a case the person has agreed to move out, or sometimes even if someone is living in a homeless shelter. Those types of assistance includes half a month's broker's fee, security deposit, moving truck fee. So during COVID, you do not need 3 estimates, but they do want 1 estimate from a moving company, and they have the right to say that the estimate that you received is too high. Same for storage fees. If someone needs temporary storage, previously it was 3 estimates, but 1 estimate will be enough. Also, first month's rent. For example, if someone will have future ability, but they just don't have any savings, so they need that first month's rent in order to get the key to the apartment. That is usually for clients who receive some type of Social Security benefit, but HRA will assist with paying that first month's rent if the person has future ability to pay their rent.
Okay, so there are other ways to get rent arrears aside from just applying for a one-shot deal or a rent arrears grant from HRA. The best is, you know, trying to find a government program that's going to provide ongoing rental assistance. So the ones that are, you know, run either by New York State or New York City, are FEPS, so the Family Homelessness and Eviction Prevention Supplement. I'm sure many of you have heard of FEPS before. It's a result of a lot of litigation against the city because they're, the shelter allowances really don't help people stay in apartments. They are so low that it is laughable in comparison to New York City rents. And so this program came out of that litigation to try and keep families who receive ongoing cash assistance in their homes. Similarly, CityFEPS is kind of like the child of a bunch of other programs that used to exist that are now all rolled into one. So all of the link programs that you may have been familiar with before, the old CityFEPS, and I think a few others are now just one big CityFEPS program. The foster care rent subsidy, a subsidy for folks with HIV/AIDS, and then for rent arrears, but not ongoing rental assistance, there is home base, which we discussed before, has a lot of government funded money as well as private money. There is the COVID rent relief extension program, and there are charities. And then we'll go through each of these in the next slides.
So FEPS is specifically for families that have a child under the age of 18 or under the age of 19 and still in high school or a high school equivalent program, where at least one person receives cash assistance. So the way that the FEPS amount would work is the household would still receive shelter allowance, but FEPS would provide a subsidy, which either covers the entire rent or part of the rent. And that depends on what income is coming into the household. There are 7 basic rules, but you might need to know a lot of welfare rules in order to figure out if a family will be approved for FEPS. Generally, if a client is applying for FEPS, the FEPS unit will pay up to $9,000 in arrears, with exceptions for special circumstances up to $12,000. During COVID, they have been paying more, but it is very difficult because there are a lot of households that, because of COVID, their cases were paused and now they owe a whole lot more than $9,000. So a lot of applicants had to go to other charities in order to get the amounts that are over 12,000. Unfortunately, Homebase cannot be one of those organizations because, as Amber explained before, the amount of money coming from HRA and Homebase are coming from the same pot. So while Homebase is a great resource for a lot of cases, it cannot be a resource in order to lower the FEPS amount. If the arrears are over $12,000, try and get the application. Try and lower the arrears, but it's also, if you have an application that's at 9,000 and you know that the next month's rent is going to put it over, or is at 8,500 and you know the next month is going to put it over, get in the application immediately. The application will be told for 6 months. However, it's still important to move as quickly as possible. Like we said before, with high arrears, charity money and client money is very helpful. Of course, a lot of our clients are struggling during the time of COVID, but if they are able to possibly get any assistance and save some money, they can use that in order to lower the arrears and be eligible to be accepted onto the FEPS program.
Yeah, and we do say just to get it in at 9,000, because once it is approved, even if it takes 3 or 4 months, it'll be approved retroactively as if your client was approved immediately. And so they'll issue all the extra money as if they should have had the subsidy the entire time. So that way, you're not losing out on funds for the client. So CityFEPS, this is a very short summary of a very big program. So this is not exhaustive. If you are applying or you're looking for a ongoing rental subsidy, we really recommend going to a community organization, a community-based organization, to have someone evaluate your eligibility. There are many in the Bronx, and I'm sure they can provide that information through the hotline, which I think the number has been put in the chat a few times. And also, just as a note, I do believe there are some people on here who are not advocates. To apply for these programs, you have to go through a legal services organization or a community-based organization. You can't just go to HRA and apply for them, unfortunately. So, make sure to call the hotline and, ask for the information. And I think you can also always call 311 to get information on where to apply for these programs. So for CityFEPS, eligibility, you have to either have a veteran who's a member of the household, have an apartment that is rent controlled, have APS services being provided to someone in the household, or a community guardianship has been granted, or there is someone in the household who was in a city shelter. So not a private shelter, a city shelter. And the household income is under 200% of the federal poverty level for the first year. This program requires a lot of documentation. You're going to need to get a W-9 tax form. This is one from the landlord, I believe, which can be a little frustrating to try and get that from them. I think most landlords actually do try to provide it because they know it means they're going to get money, or it makes them more likely to get money. But there are some landlords who are, for some reason, very obstinate with providing this information. Getting an updated breakdown, preferably through the month that you're applying. So if you're applying in January, a breakdown that goes through January. The recently signed stipulation or court order. Unfortunately, if the last stipulation was from, I don't know, March of last year, they're probably going to want a breakdown and maybe some other documentation, because if a court order is just if it's old, they're not going to rely on that record. There are specific forms that the landlord has to fill out. So the landlord's statement of understanding, the tenant has to fill out their statement of understanding, and then along with pretty much everything else, proof that they can be in the apartment for at least 1 year, and that the rent is within the levels for the household's size, and everyone's going to pay their share of their income based on program rules. Yes, we do mean, sorry, there's a question in here about, do we rent controlled or rent stabilized? A rent stabilized apartment won't cut it. It has to be a rent controlled apartment. The reason for that is, the rent control, I think there are fewer than 22,000 in the entire state of New York. And I think fewer than, I think it's between 18 and 20,000 in New York City total, which based on the entire size of the rental market is very, very low. But those rent controlled apartments sometimes will have rents at $200, $500, $600. So they want to protect those apartments at all costs. So they have added them to this program. Regular rent stabilized doesn't cut it. So we do not mean rent regulated. We do mean rent controlled only.
So the actual application. So applications for CityFEPS are initiated by community home-based locations. So the role of an advocate is to help secure the appointment and follow up with the home base to ensure that the application is processed. So one big way that I try to help as an advocate is to, if there are any documents missing from the landlord, I'll reach out to the landlord's attorney if I have their contact information and try and get that processed as quickly as possible. You can contact a home base over the phone during COVID, and what they'll normally do is set up an intake appointment first to explain to the tenant the process and what documents they need. And after they receive the documents, they'll follow up and go into the process for actually getting everything ready to submit a CityFEPS application. So it's the home base that will forward the application for HRA for final approval. And the home base also conducts the inspection. During COVID, they'll do it virtually. So that can be, that's something that the home base will take care of.
Okay, so for a limited number of households, there is a foster care rent subsidy. It's available to keep children out of foster care or to get out of foster care. So children in the community must be receiving preventative services and has a housing need. This subsidy, I've actually never had a case that I could identify where this was available. I think it's maybe happened once in my office that I'm aware of since I've been here. It is a very slow process, but they will pay up to $10,800 for arrears and will provide $300 a month for 36 months going forward. And if your arrears are over 10,800, you can actually tack on an additional 1,800 and just reduce the amount that's going to be received monthly going forward. And there are caps on how much the rent can be in apartments approved under this program, but this is one of the few programs where certain exceptions can be made. If you do have one of these, or you think someone might be eligible for this, I would, if you're in an organization that does applications, reach out to your supervisors, or if you don't have any information internally, reach out to us and we'll connect you with some folks that can help you out.
So another type of rent subsidy program is the HIV/AIDS subsidy. It's also more popularly known as HASA. So this subsidy is for a person with AIDS or the HIV virus, and the HASA is under HRA, but they have their own RAU-like process for arrears or their ongoing subsidy. The person who is receiving HASA must be eligible for SSI or SSD or be receiving SSI or SSD. They have specific amounts that they pay for rent, and they are expected to use 30% of their SSI or other income to contribute to the rent. HASA can approve more on top of that, depending on the household size or how much the rent is. When you do realize that you have a client with HASA, it's important to ask them who their caseworker is so that you can just go directly to that person, because like I said before, they have their own process and they usually work very quickly to resolve the issues for the clients that they work with. It's also very important not to reveal the health status of any of your clients who receive the HASA subsidy. Normally, if I'm advocating for someone in court or with the landlord's attorney, I'll say my client has a subsidy that will assist, because sometimes the judges want to know more specific information, but I'll just say my client has a subsidy. And so it is important to remember, even if it is helpful that your client has HASA, it is still medical information that is private to that individual.
Okay, so home-based arrears. We said home-based a lot. They are one of the best places to get money, just because they have more money than a lot of other charities or programs. So this program is run by DHS, so Department of Homeless Services, and they contract with nonprofits. And that's what home base is. So you can call 311, or you can go online to find the locations. I think each home base serves different zip codes, so you don't just want to go to the one that may be closest to you. I made that mistake early on. I looked it up. I said, oh, this one's like 3 blocks from you. Go here. Turns out it's a whole different zip code. It's not the one for their zip code, and I wasted like half of my client's day. So don't do that. Call 311 or go online and make sure you're sending them to the right place. The funding is to divert generally families from the shelter system. Homebase does want you to go to HRA first, so this is one of those situations where you might have the one-shot deal application pending, and then the caseworker tells you go get some money from home base. You go to home base, and then ask for money there, get the approval, bring it back, show HRA, and then you can get the full money. They will generally approve 1,000 to 2,000, but as in every rent arrears grant, you have to show future ability to pay the rent. And you're going to need to demonstrate that once the rent is paid, you're going to get your client to a zero balance, which means they don't owe any more rent. So this sometimes it ends up being that you're not going to get a check from home base. You're going to get a commitment letter. So you're going to get a letter that says if they can show us that they achieved, approvals from HRA or other charities, and all together it adds up to get them to a zero balance, then we'll issue the check. So that's the letter that you're going to take around HRA or other charities to demonstrate an approval. In May and June, we've noticed that they tend to pay higher amounts, and I think that's just because they have more money then. They operate on a fiscal year that's not January to December. It's, I think, July 1st to June 31st. So, just keep that in mind that it's going to be a little harder to get money in December than it is in May. This money is not, it's not a loan. It is a grant, so they don't have to pay it back. And you should be aware you can't go to home base every year. You might be able to go get a one shot every year for a few years in a row, but you can't do that at home base.
So a lot of you might have heard about the COVID Rent Relief Extension Program. It's run by the state of New York, and I'll list the eligibility criteria. So it must be a renter and have a New York State residence. They must have lost income during April 1st, 2020 and July 31st, 2020. So before March 7th, and at the time the application is submitted, the household must be at 80% of the area median income, adjusted for the household size. So that's information you can look up online. The household must also be rent burdened. So what that means is that the amount of money that they're using from their income to pay the rent is a significant amount. So before so there were 2 rounds of this application. For the first round, applicants must have been rent burdened before March 1st, 2020. This is no longer required. If you know someone who has applied already, they do not need to submit a new application in order to be reconsidered. The state says that they are automatically reconsidering all rejected applications. The payment, it will cover the increase in the rent burden due to the loss of income. And the application is open now through February 1st and can be found at hcr.ny.gov/RRP. It is online. The individual does have to sign up for a New York State online account, but they don't need to finish the entire application in one sitting because there is information that you might need to upload, but they would be able to return to that application by remembering their login information, which is very important, and being able to log in at a later time. Oh, Amber, you're on mute.
Thanks. There are charities that will provide additional grants, so money that will not have to be paid back to help pay off rent arrears. So advocates can call 212-962-4795, and they generally can tell you, if the charity has money or not. So like I said, like the fiscal year for home base, it's not the January to December. Other places might have different, time periods where they have more money, or maybe they just got a big donation from someone and they have money again, because maybe they ran out last month. So, before sending clients to specific places, I think it's helpful to give the Emergency Rent Coalition a call to make sure that you're not wasting your client's time. Definitely use this when a client has been denied an HRA grant or loan, or where they won't pay the entire arrears. Each charity does have its own form and process, but you can do one form through the Emergency Rent Coalition, which is helpful. Most charities give under $1,000 or up to $1,000. So you might end up, if the arrears are substantial, having to go to a lot of places. I remember I had a client who had, I think it was $26,000 in arrears, and they had received a bunch of help from HRA in the past. So HRA wanted like $10,000 from the charities, and it took, I think, eight charities to get all of that covered, but we eventually got there, and we were able to save that apartment for that client. So it can take a lot of time, but it's definitely worth it. And we had someone ask a question in the chat before about, for folks that don't have an immigration status that would let them get help from HRA, where can they go? What do they do? Unfortunately, a lot of charities do have, some sort of immigration status requirement, but there is a new program called Project Parachute that's being operated out of home base, where folks without another qualifying immigration status can apply to get rent arrears. So, as we said before, call 311, call Housing Court Answers. I think someone from home base was here and put their information in the chat. Reach out to them so that you can get your clients access to those funds. And I think the next slide just has a non-exhaustive list of various charities that provide funding in the Bronx. And then just remember, some schools and even some religious organizations might also have funds to help with rental arrears. So if your client is active in their religious institution, you might want to check there. If they are going to a community college, I know some of them have rent arrears grants, so think big. And I think that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah, so I'm gonna stop sharing so that we can answer more questions.
I know we had a bunch of questions in the chat. It was hard to keep track of them. So if folks have questions, I think we can stay on for a few minutes. I think everyone who's still here, I think we advertised this as being an hour and a half, and it's been 2 hours. So I appreciate you for being here. But yeah, let us know if you have any questions. We have a question. How much more will HRA pay over $12,000? They may not pay $12,000 in every circumstance. It really depends on what program you're applying for, what the particular circumstances of the client are. I can't tell you that like HRA will approve every $10,000 ask, right? Like it really depends. Which is why we say, do those advocacy letters and include as much information as possible. Demonstrate why it is so critical that the families stay in that apartment. So, that's really where it comes down to ties to the community, their medical services. Every little piece of information counts. The higher the arrears are.
I'll echo that. Like there is a formula to this, but everyone's story is different. So when you are speaking with a client or when you are trying to express to RAU what the situation is, remember that your client's story is different, right? So if they do have children, like what is the story with that? How did they fall into arrears? So there is a formula and you want to stick to it, but always remember that this is an individual person who has gone through a different life circumstance than your previous client. So for Cherise Thompson, who asked about a client who applied for SNAP benefits, but was denied because her income was too high, and the income is unemployment. So HRA considers unemployment unearned income. So that means it's counted dollar for dollar. which means that when you compare it to the chart that we showed you before for families and for individuals, or all adult households, they will match whatever that household's income is with what's called the standard of need. And if that household's income is over the standard of need, then they are ineligible for certain benefits. Unemployment, I've also had a lot of clients who are no longer receiving SNAP, excuse me, or cash assistance because they now receive unemployment. It's a difficult situation for a lot of our clients to be in because the way that HRA sees it, because their limits are so low, if a family is over the amount that they consider to be poverty, then they are ineligible for the benefits of HRA. So it's a very, very low standard, unfortunately. So it puts a lot of families in a lot of difficult situations. And
I just want to
yeah, go ahead.
note that there are different formulas for ongoing cash assistance and for SNAP benefits. For someone receiving unemployment, it's very hard to get cash assistance, but they may be eligible depending on how much they're getting for SNAP. I put the calculator that we usually use as a kind of a quick reference guide to see if someone is eligible. But it depends on a lot of factors. So, just receiving unemployment might not do it, but like their costs are low. Like they have a very low rent. It might mean that they wouldn't be eligible. Like you have to put the factors in the formula and see. And obviously, if they are denied, you can always do a fair hearing and to try and to get that decision overturned. Or if like you're absolutely sure that they qualify, just reapply again. And if they have zero food, zero money for food, they might be able to get emergency benefits. We have a question. What if a client has to repay student loans and that is affecting their disposable income for rent? This is a tough one because HRA generally, I don't find them to be super sympathetic to other expenses that don't relate to emergency needs. So like medical expenses and medical bills, they I think are more sensitive to. Utility bills they're sensitive to. But when it comes to loans, I think that they tend to say you should prioritize your rent and go into default on your loans, even though that has other consequences. It's an unfortunate situation, but they do ask that you use your resources to pay rent first in most circumstances. I think those are all the questions that we got to come in. For anyone with individual questions, you can always call the new tenant hotline that's run by the city. You can call 311 and say you want to speak with a housing attorney, and they will connect you to, or a housing advocate, they will connect you to a housing attorney or paralegal that works at a legal services organization. It is staffed by I'm actually staffing it next Tuesday. So we rotate out and we'll be the ones answering the calls, and we'll talk to you about your individual circumstances, try to provide you advice on the spot. And if you fall into, if you have an active case, you might actually be able to get a referral for legal representation or other assistance. So, make sure to call that number for your individual questions. Someone asked, does any of this apply to Westchester? Some of it does, yes. So if you go back to that Rent Arrears grant chart, those first 3 grants are available statewide. So the ESNA, the EAA, and the EAF. Every Department of Social Services processes Rent Arrears grant applications for those types of households and cases. Unfortunately, a lot of departments of social services outside of New York City are a lot stricter. They don't have, an exception to policy. We just want to help you out because we understand what you're going through type grant. They usually stick straight to what the rules are in those statutes. But Westchester does have charities that can help with rent to a certain extent. I think you can contact, is it Mid Hudson Valley Legal Services covers Westchester? There are legal services organizations and benefits community-based organizations in Westchester. Just do a quick Google. If you can't find anything, shoot me an email and I'll try to connect you with some folks.
Okay, if nobody has any more questions, I want to say thank you to Ms. Marshall and Ms. Barry for such a wonderful presentation and informative presentation. For those that wants to see the presentation again, you can always go to our website, housingcodeanswers.org, and you'll be able to see this presentation again and other old presentation that we have done past in 2020. Also to let you know that HCA's is open from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, except court holidays. I guess nobody has any more questions, then we should end this training, right? Yep.
Yes, thanks everybody. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Aissatou and Amber, so much for the training. I'm going to close it now, so everyone have a lovely day.
Bye.